Tell me where it is!
I don't know!
Enough! Leave her be. This isn't over.
On the coldest winter day in the Wild West, a cruel rancher raised his hand to strike a helpless woman. The whole town stayed silent, until the quiet cowboy stepped through the door and said 4 words that changed everything. The winter wind moved slowly across the empty plains, and the sky, above the old frontier town of Red Hollow, looked pale and tired, like it had watched too many cruel days and too many lonely nights. Snow lay across the wooden roofs, and the dirt roads had turned hard and white, and the few people who walked outside kept their heads down, because winter in the West could be colder than a bullet and meaner than a bad man. In the far end of the town, near the broken fence of an old ranch house, a young woman named Leora carried a small bucket of water. Her coat was thin, and her boots were worn, and every step in the snow left a tired mark behind her. She had come to this town months ago after losing her father on the long road west, and the people of Red Hollow had never truly welcomed her. They watched her quietly and whispered behind doors, because strangers in hard towns often carried trouble. Inside the old ranch house lived a man named Brack Fenlow, a heavy man with a cruel face and a voice like gravel. He owned the ranch and the land around it, and he believed the world belonged to men who could take it by force. Leora worked for him, cleaning the house and feeding the animals, because she had nowhere else to go. But Brack treated her like a thing that had no voice and no worth. That morning the wind pushed hard against the door when Leora stepped inside the ranch house. Brack sat near the fireplace, drinking from a tin cup, his 2 ranch hands. Dester and Halric stood nearby, laughing quietly about something cruel. Brack looked up slowly, his eyes narrow and cold. "You took too long," he said in a slow, rough voice. Leora lowered her eyes and placed the bucket down near the stove. The pump was frozen. She said softly, "It took time to break the ice." Brack stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor, and the sound made the room feel smaller. He walked toward her, heavy boots thudding on the boards. "You always got an excuse, girl," he said. Dester laughed, and Halric leaned against the wall, watching. Like a man waiting for a show, Leora tried to move past Brack, but his hand shot out, grabbing her arm tight enough to hurt. "You think I pay you to wander around town all morning," he said. Pain moved across her face, but she stayed quiet, because she had learned silence was sometimes the only shield a person had in cruel places. Outside, the wind carried a distant sound of hooves, slow, steady hooves approaching the town, but inside the ranch house nobody noticed yet. Brack squeezed her arm harder. "Maybe you need reminding how things work around here." He raised his hand, ready to strike, and then the door opened. The cold wind rushed in with a swirl of snow, and standing in the doorway was a tall, quiet cowboy wrapped in a long, dust-colored coat. His hat sat low over calm. Eyes and snow rested across his shoulders like the winter itself had followed him into the room. The man said nothing at first. He simply stood there watching. Brack turned his head, annoyed. "This is private business, stranger," he growled. The cowboy stepped inside, slowly closing the door behind him. His boots left faint, wet marks on the wooden floor. His face was calm, but something in his presence made the room feel different, like a storm was standing quietly in human form. His name was Callan Rowe, though nobody in the town knew it yet. He had ridden through many towns across the West, and most people described him the same way: quiet, steady, and dangerous when pushed too far. His eyes moved from Brack to Leora, and then back again. Brack noticed the look and laughed. "You here for work, cowboy, or you lost your way?" Callan removed his gloves slowly and placed them on the nearby table, still silent. Brack grew irritated. "You deaf or just dumb?" Dester stepped forward, grinning. "Boss, maybe he wants to watch." Halric laughed loudly, but Callan finally spoke, his voice calm and low. "Let go of her." The words were simple, but the room grew still. Brack stared at him for a moment and then laughed louder than before. "You telling me what to do in my own house?" Callan did not move. "Let go of her," he repeated. Leora looked toward him with surprise. She had never seen this man before yet. His voice carried a strange, quiet certainty. Brack pushed her slightly as he turned fully toward the cowboy. "You got guts, stranger, I will give you that." He released Leora, but only to step closer to Callan, his large shadow stretching across the floor. "You know who I am." Callan shook his head slowly. "No." Brack smiled with cruel pride. "I own this ranch, I own the land around it, and everyone in this town knows not to cross me." Callan looked around the room once, as if measuring the walls, the men, and the silence. Then his eyes returned to Brack. "Not everyone—" The words landed heavy. Desta straightened, and Halric stepped away from the wall, sensing something was wrong with this quiet stranger. Brack frowned. "You looking for trouble, Cowboy?" Callan tilted his head slightly. "No," Brack sneered. "Then you better walk back out that door." The wind outside pushed against the walls again, and somewhere, far away, a loose sign creaked slowly. Callan spoke again, calm, steady. "I said, do not touch her again." Silence filled the room like smoke. Brack suddenly swung his fist forward, aiming for the cowboy face, but Callan moved faster than anyone expected. His hand caught. Brack wrist twisting sharply, and the big man dropped to one knee with a shocked grunt. Desta cursed and rushed forward, but Callan released Brack and stepped aside, sending the heavy man stumbling into his own ranch hand. Halric reached for a knife, but stopped when Callan's eyes met his. Those eyes were quiet, but they held the weight of many fights already survived. Brack pushed himself back up, furious, his face red with anger. "You dead man, Cowboy." Callan remained calm. "Maybe." Leora stood frozen near the stove, her heart racing as she watched the strange moment unfold. She had lived months under Brack cruelty, and nobody had ever stepped between them before. The room held a tension, like a gun about to fire. Finally, Brack spat on the floor and stepped back. "Get out," he growled. Callan picked up his gloves slowly. He turned toward the door, then paused. His voice carried one last quiet warning. "If I hear you touched her again, the winter will not be the coldest thing in this town." Then he walked out into the snow. The door closed behind him, and the wind swallowed the sound of his boots. Inside the ranch house, nobody spoke for several long seconds. Brack stared at the door with burning rage, while Desta and Halric looked uneasy. For the first time in years, and Leora stood quietly holding the edge of the table, realizing something in her life had just changed, though she did not yet know how much. Outside, the quiet cowboy mounted his horse and looked once toward the small town of Red Hollow. The wind moved across the empty road, and the pale sky stretched far above the frozen plains. Callan pulled his coat tighter and rode slowly toward the edge of town, unaware that this single moment had just begun a story that the winter itself would remember for years to come. The winter morning in Red Hollow came slowly, and the pale sun rose over the frozen plains like a tired lantern in a cold sky. The town looked quiet, but beneath the silence, something restless moved through the wooden streets, and the wind carried whispers from door to door about the stranger who had walked into Brack Fenlow House and faced him without fear. People in towns like Red Hollow remembered small things, because small things often became big trouble, and the name of the quiet cowboy began drifting through the town, though nobody truly knew who he was or where he came from. Some said he had ridden from the north, others believed he was a former soldier or a bounty hunter who had seen too many fights. But one thing was certain: the man carried a calm strength that unsettled cruel men. Leora woke early inside the small room behind the ranch house. Where she slept, the thin blanket did little to hold back. The cold and frost clung to the edges of the window. She sat up slowly, remembering the moment from the night before when the stranger had spoken. Those simple words, "Do not touch her again." No one had ever said those words for her before. For a long time she sat quietly staring at the pale morning light, thinking about the calm voice and steady eyes of the cowboy, who had walked away as if danger meant nothing to him. But she also knew Brack Fenlow. Men like Brack did not forget humiliation. Outside the ranch house, Brack stood near the barn with Desta and Halric. The anger in his face had not faded through the night. His pride had been wounded, and men like him treated wounded pride like a sickness that demanded revenge. He kicked a frozen rock across the yard. "Find that cowboy," he growled. Desta nodded slowly. "Town is not that big boss. We will find him." Halric spat into the snow. What you want done with him? Brack's eyes hardened like iron. I want him broken. So bad no one in this town ever forgets. What happens when someone crosses me? The two men rode toward town, their horses moving through the white road, as the wind continued to scrape across the empty land. Meanwhile, the quiet cowboy sat inside the small corner of the town stable, brushing snow from his horse. Saddle, the stable owner, an old man named Garin, watched him carefully from across the stall. You stirred trouble yesterday, the old man said slowly. Callan continued working calmly. Maybe, Garin shook his head. Brack Fenlo runs this town with fear. Most folks here survive by looking the other way. Callan finished tightening the saddle strap. Fear only lasts until someone stands up. Garin studied him for a moment. You planning to stay here long? Callan looked toward the open stable door, where snow drifted quietly across the road. Long enough. The old man sighed because he had seen men try to challenge Brack before, and none of them had ended well. But something about this cowboy felt different, like the calm before a mountain storm. At that moment, the sound of hooves approached, and Dester and Halric rode into the street outside. The stable, their eyes scanning the area like hunting dogs. They spotted the horse first. Then they saw the man. Dester stepped down slowly from his saddle. Well, look what we found, he muttered. Halric grinned darkly. Boss gonna be pleased. Callan walked out from the stable, brushing dust from his coat. His expression remained quiet as the two men approached. Dester cracked his knuckles. You should have kept riding yesterday, cowboy. Halric pulled the knife from his belt, turning it lazily in his hand. Brack wants to have a word with you. Callan's eyes moved from one man to the other. No. The word came calm and simple. Dester laughed harshly. You do not get a choice. He lunged forward, swinging his fist, but Callan moved aside with smooth precision. His hand struck Dester's shoulder, sending the man crashing into a wooden post. Halric rushed forward with the knife, but Callan grabbed his wrist, twisting hard. The blade fell into the snow, and a quick strike sent Halric stumbling backward. The fight lasted only seconds, but both ranch hands found themselves on the ground, groaning in pain. Callan stood quietly over them. Tell Brack Fenlo something for me. Dester glared up at him through the snow. Callan's voice stayed calm. The next time he raises a hand to that woman, I will come for him. Then he turned and walked away down the street, leaving the two men humiliated in the frozen dirt. By afternoon, the story had spread across the entire town. Brack Fenlo heard every word. His anger grew into something darker. That evening, he stormed into the ranch house where Leora worked near the stove. Fear returned to her chest the moment she saw his face. You think that cowboy can protect you, he growled. She stayed silent. Brack grabbed her arm again, rage boiling through him. He is not here now. But before he could do anything, the door slammed open. Callan rose, stepped inside once more, snow falling from his coat. The room fell silent. Brack turned slowly, his eyes filled with burning hatred. You just signed your grave, cowboy. Callan's voice remained steady. Let her go. Brack laughed harshly. Or what? Callan took a step forward. Or I end this. For a moment, the wind howled outside, like the land itself was watching the moment. Brack suddenly drew his revolver, raising it toward the cowboy. But Callan was faster. His hand moved like lightning, his own revolver already drawn. The sound of a single shot cracked through the house like thunder across the winter plains. Brack Fenlo froze. Then the gun slipped from his hand. He collapsed onto the wooden floor, the cruelty that had ruled Red Hollow for years, ending in a single moment. Silence spread slowly through the room. Leora stared in shock. Callan lowered the revolver calmly. Dester and Halric, who had followed their boss into the house, stood frozen, in fear, realizing the man before them was not someone they could ever defeat. Callan's eyes met theirs. Leave. They did not argue. Within seconds, they ran from the house, disappearing into the cold night. The town of Red Hollow slowly began to gather outside, as word spread that Brack Fenlo was gone. For the first time in years, the weight of fear lifted from the town streets. Inside the house, Leora looked at the quiet cowboy with tears forming in her eyes. Why did you do it? She asked softly. Callan holstered his revolver and looked toward the doorway, where snow drifted gently into the room. Because some winters last too long. The answer was simple, but it carried a truth she understood deeply. The cruel winter of her life had finally ended. The next morning, the sun rose brighter over Red Hollow than it had in many years. People stepped outside, their homes with cautious hope and whispers of relief. Near the edge of town, Callan Rowe prepared his horse once again. Leora walked toward him through the snow. "You are leaving," she said. Callan nodded slowly. "This town does not need me anymore." She looked down at the white ground for a moment before speaking again. "Thank you." Callan placed his hat back on his head. "Take care of yourself." He mounted the horse and turned toward the open plains, the endless horizon stretching far beyond the frozen land. Leora watched as the quiet cowboy rode away, becoming smaller against the wide western sky. And though the wind still carried the cold breath of winter, the town of Red Hollow would forever remember the day a quiet cowboy walked through their door and spoke the words that changed everything. "Do not touch her again.